Good morning and welcome to another edition of Civil War Reflections with Brian Steele Wills. Today I thought we would look at some of the ways that the soldiers used humor to make it through their camp life, but also through their existence in the service. Sometimes humor was a wonderful antidote to all of the other depressing things that one experienced, from poor diet to the loss of friends and messmates and others on the battlefield, to even challenges at home. And of course, some of that started early in some of the earliest experiences of examples of humor. If you look at the hodgepodge of uniforms in the earliest days of the war, some of that could create a real, genuine reaction among other troops. One of the professionals, one of the regular Army veterans who was in the service early on, noticed that that some of these volunteers came from all walks of life, and some of those included units that were influenced by the French Zouave type of uniform and formation. And one of the soldiers, when one of the Zouave folk walked by, he said, "What's this you're wearing? Who are you, and what are you doing?" And he said that the soldier looked back and he says, "I'm not only a Zouave, I'm an officer." And he says, "An officer? I thought you were a circus clown." And I think that gives you a little bit of an idea of what some people thought about all of these garish uniforms. If you have seen pictures of the Zouaves, you know they wore the bright uniforms and really were very colorful in their personas. Sometimes men would come through the camps with new outfits on, and invariably the soldiers would greet them with sidebar comments. So, for instance, a fellow that came in with a big new piece of headgear had the likelihood of hearing, "Come out of that hat, I see your legs," by some of the soldiers, and "Look out under that parrot shell. What you're wearing is going to explode." And then sometimes, "Take that camp kettle off your head. Aren't you ashamed to steal a poor soldier's camp kettle?" And then sometimes when the soldiers would be wearing fancy mustaches, like the big handlebar mustache that some folks found very appealing. Somebody was invariably likely to say, "Take those mice out of your mouth. I can see their tails wagging." And then sometimes you would hear other kinds of comments along that line as well. Then, of course, I think probably the most common thing was when somebody took on airs. Someone in the formation would yell, "Hey, mister, where's your mule?" The historian who wrote about the life of Johnny Reb and Billy Yank, Bell I. Wiley, from whom some of these examples have been pulled, he would say that the comment, "Where's your mule?" was very much like later on the comment that would be very pervasive, "Where's Elmer? Where's Elmer?" And then, we know in civilian life, "Where's Elmo?" So, sometimes you'd get all of these different types of reactions to people that were putting on airs. Soldiers typically like to find a way to bring those folks down a peg or two if they could. And then sometimes it was just good old fun. Some of the letters that are in the Wiley Sword collection that's housed at Pamplin Park have quite a number of letters that include various stories. I'll share some of those with you. One of them is from a fellow named I.B. Goodrich. He was a member of the 21st Massachusetts, and he put a big description about a military operation in North Carolina that I think was about attacking New Bern. And the beginning of it, he talks about, he gets into the fighting itself down the line, of course, takes a much more serious tone then. But the beginning of it, he says, quote, "When the landing commenced, there was a great anxiety among the standard bearers of the various regiments to get their flags ashore first. And it was amusing to witness the racing which took place among the small boats containing the standards as they tried to outdo themselves to be number one, to put their flag on this soil of the rebellion before anyone else." And so that was, again, just one of those moments where you know it's going to be, you're going to be confronting enemy soldiers, you're going to be engaged in combat, and yet you have that lighthearted moment. There was a Union general in the Tidewater area that came to be in charge there from New York. His name was John James Peck, and John Peck was renowned for building these elaborate earthworks. And, of course, the soldiers themselves didn't take long before they tired of such forensics. If they were out building and digging and dragging, one of them at one point had said, we didn't mind building the breastworks, but we didn't like being mules, because they had, of course, to drag the trees off and clear not only the fields of fire, but clear off the land that they wanted to then take the trees to use as shoring for the parapets, for the earthworks. And so, they comment was that they didn't really want to be mules. Well, in this one instance, this one person says, "I say, Bill," to one of his colleagues, says, I hope old Peck will be dead 2 weeks before I do." And the fellow looked at him and says, "Why is that so?" He says, "Well, because he'll have health so strongly fortified that I can't get in." And that, of course, was a reference to his proclivity for building these enormous and powerful earthwork fortifications. And if he could get to hell there first, this fellow hoped he could he would keep him from having to go in himself. Some of the men that were engaged in this operation in Suffolk were there to try to draw supplies from various counties, not only in southeastern Virginia, but in northeastern North Carolina. And one of the gentlemen that wants to go out there is going to confront or come in contact with a family in North Carolina. And he writes home, he says, "You would be amused to see the merriment the boys have at the ignorance of some of the North Carolina people of the low country." He was from Virginia himself. He's writing home, and he says some of them seem to be ignorant of the war going on. And when asked something about the war, they believed it was something that must be happening out there in Virginia or somewhere out of the way. So here they were in North Carolina, of course, about to have the war arrive on their doorstep, but they were not that clear about where this war was or what it meant. And so for them, it must be up there in Virginia somewhere. One of the nemesis of the Suffolk campaign was a small Union gunboat fleet, which are mostly ferry boats and whatnot that had been some artillery pieces put on them, and infantry had been pressed into service as artillerists. And so one of the comments for the Federals was, of course, they didn't want these makeshift ferry boats in the river getting torn up by Confederate artillery. Well, Confederate artillery did do a lot of damage to some of those Union vessels, but the Federals came back and kind of got their revenge a little bit later on in the area around Hills Point or Fort Huger, or the Old Fort as it was sometimes called. But at one point, the Confederates said that the Federals were shooting at them with something, quote, a little smaller than a large beer keg. So they said they were wondering the size of these projectiles that were coming in. And one of the officers, John Bell Hood, will say to one of his men, "Calhoun, I want you to go charge that gunboat. I need to have it in my business and not to be out done, Calhoun thundered back, "Gunboat hell, by thunder, General Hood, if you are bound to have a gunboat, and nothing will satisfy you but a gunboat, damned if I won't buy you one or two, and then or get the First Texas to steal you a whole fleet. That regiment can steal anything." So the Texans were having fun with not only the enemy and their commander, but themselves. The comment one time was that the chickens had to roost pretty high, otherwise they would be found to be in a cook pot by the Texans. One of the other comments, I think Bell Wiley mentions in one of his texts, is he talks about a fellow who's getting ready to make a soup, and he's got a turkey, and apparently he gets distracted and gets pulled away from the a pot, and when he comes back eventually and tries to stir the pot, he's reaching in to do his get a spoon to do the stirring, and he doesn't feel anything, and he looked in and the pot was empty, and he said all that was left was a feather where his turkey had been. So apparently some folks had decided to get there ahead of him and go ahead and relieve him of his turkey. So one of the things that happens is the soldiers find ways of dealing with the boredom of camp life, the monotony of camp life, the dangers of the battlefield, with humor as much as possible. And of course, they were dealing with weather as well, and more than once there would be jokes about the weather, that Virginia used to be in the Union, now it's in the mud, and a lot of other ones. I think it was Bud Robertson, James I. Robertson Jr., who wrote Soldiers Blue and Gray, who said that during Burnside's Mud March, some waggish Confederate actually held up a placard that said Burnside's is stuck in the mud. So, that was very likely. Bud also talks about the kinds of boards that are crudely labeled on the tents, shebangs, and cabins of Confederate soldiers, and, Union soldiers too, for that matter. And some of the Louisiana Battery, for instance, would put up signs. One said Buzzard's Roost. Another one said Swine Hotel. One of the Union regiments apparently put up the Rest for the Pilgrims, unquote. And then another one, Uncle Tom's Cabin, unquote. They had all kinds of, Old Abe's Parlor was one of them. Chateau de Salt Junk, which is making fun of the food, making fun of their rations. One of the waggish Confederates put up that he lived in Devil's Inn. And then I thought one is particularly funny. One of them put up a sign on their cabin or wherever they were holed up, and they said, "We're out." So he was having a little bit of fun with "We're out." The streets had names. Sometimes you would see Lincoln's Avenue or Lee Boulevard, according to Bud. And then when it was weather was iffy, you get Mud Lane, Starvation Avenue. One time the camp chaplain was so awash with water that somebody decided to put up a sign nearby that said Holy Park on it. And so there you have it. And back in the days of the fighting around Chattanooga, particularly, of course, Missionary Ridge, the attack there led to some moments of levity, you might say, and otherwise an otherwise odd sort of situation. The fellow by the name of Michael Sheridan, again, this comes from the Wiley Sword papers that have not been published, recorded the unintended effects of 3 privates who sought to experiment with a piece of ordnance that they found that had not exploded. And they talked about trying to do what they could to tap into it, mess with it, to examine it. And then finally, of course, you can probably imagine when they did something a bit too much to it, the shell exploded, and one of the three men was actually killed. The other two were wounded. Or the one that had set it off was actually trying to reach around a tree, thinking the tree would protect him, and he did not do well with that explosion. He lost an arm. And of course, the foolishness, we would say, the thinning of the herd, and the whole notion that somehow the people that aren't that smart figure out a way to sort of take themselves out of the equation. In this case, the soldiers had someone who watched all of this happen, and and that was, I guess, this Sheridan fellow, Michael Sheridan. He said that he would imagine that the way that the soldiers that survived this blast would later on attribute the loss of their limbs to having, quote, stormed Missionary Ridge. Well, of course, they did storm Missionary Ridge, but that's wasn't what cost them their limbs. What cost them their limbs was their foolishness, their own foolishness. Union General one time said in the book I wrote on Inglorious Passages, I talked about this fellow, and this Union General said he watched people rolling rounds into the fire to see what would happen. And he said the people that did these things never seemed to suffer. It was always some innocent bystander or somebody nearby that would have some terrible outcome that would occur because of the foolishness of these individuals. And of course, soldiers would find humor in a lot of things, not just in the foolish escapades of their fellow soldiers, and not just in the weather, not just in the odd outfits and accoutrement of the officers and staff officers and others. Sometimes they enjoyed levity with each other, even on simple things like eating. We talked about the fellow that said take that cook pot off your head to one of the soldiers that came in with an odd piece of equipment on his head. He said, you've stolen it, you've taken it from the cook pot. Well, one of the Confederates was having a little bit of fun. He said, when we get short of rations, someone or two would go out and hunt up a vicious hog or sheep or steer that showed fright. And by showing fright, they did something that, quote, compelled us to kill them in self-defense, so that when they came back, of course, with the hog, the sheep, or the steer, they could claim they did it in self-defense. I think one of the sadder stories was a fellow that off of Tybee Island in June of 1862 was talking about a storm that had hit and deposited a trove of beer and wine that the soldiers quickly salvaged and began to use. And their nickname was Perry's Saints, because their Colonel James Perry had been a minister, and he'd always tried to have his men on the straight and narrow. And they had such an enormous time of imbibing upon this gift that had suddenly landed on the shores nearby that of course they got quite considerably inebriated, and Perry got quite upset to the point that he actually had apparently a heart attack and ended up perishing from this incident that his men had foisted this beer and this wine on out of the container and celebrated with themselves to the point that they got pretty drunk, and he apparently found that more than he could handle. So sometimes there were some unexpected results that came from some of the good times that people were having. One of the Confederates that was in Robert E. Lee's march toward Maryland, crossing into across the Potomac River, he'd actually been in the Antietam or Sharpsburg campaign, and this was the Gettysburg campaign, so it was the second time that he was crossing the Potomac River. And he said, looked at his comrades, and he said, "Well, boys, I've been seceding for 2 years, and now I've gone back into the Union again. So he had a little bit of fun with the notion that he was going back above the borderline from the Confederate States into the United States. And he said, I'd been seceding for 2 years, and now I'm back in the Union again. One fellow was so cold and wet from the steady rain that he had gone through that he knew that if there was a fight to come, or if he was going to be assigned to the picket lines, that he was really wary of whether he would be able to fire accurately, and it bothered him because he prided himself on being a great shot. And he said he could think about all the times that he'd shot before and been well, and here he was shooting shots that seemed to be going too high. And he just said, please guys, don't tell, or said, please boys, don't tell anyone about my aim. You know me to be a better shot, even though if you see this example of my sharpshooting, you'll say that I'm going to have to take your rifle away and give you that old ball splitter from your daddy's War of 1812. So he was afraid that his status as a sharpshooter would be called into question, and he had a little bit of fun with that about the ancient types of weapons that he might have to hold in his hand and fight the old-fashioned way if the sharpshooter's rifle was taken out from him. Probably nobody understood humor better, even though he was tremendously melancholy. Probably nobody understood humor better than Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln often deflected difficult moments with humor, and he would come up with stories and tales and all of this, that, and the other. And one of the stories was about a criticism of the government's policies, and he says, you people would be like the fellow watching someone on a tightrope. And he said we would always be saying, oh, he's going to go too far to the left, and he's going to go too far for the right, he's going to do this, he's going to do that. He said, why don't we wait until he gets to the other side, and then we can say how he did it. And so he would have a lot of fun because he'd make a story or a joke or a bit of humor out of something that was quite serious and deflect the fact that these men that were sitting there with him were criticizing the government's policies. And he says, you can do that when all this is over, and then we'll see what everybody has to say. Another instance, near the end of the war, a bunch of Kentuckians, of course, had stayed in the Union, and I don't know why they wanted this, but they wanted, for whatever reason, to have Benjamin Butler reassigned to command over the state. And Lincoln looked at him and he says, you people howled when Butler went to New Orleans. Others howled when he was removed from that command. Somebody has been howling ever since about his assignment to military command. He says, how long will it be before you who are howling for his assignment to rule Kentucky will be howling to me to have him removed? And of course, he will be removed from his command. Ulysses Grant had been looking for an opportunity, and eventually, right there at the end of the war, finally gets him out of command. One of the Union generals, soldiers, I guess, he may not have been a general, said something to the effect of he reckoned that Butler would be good, but he might be good to be the military governor of Richmond. So, sort of that military background might come to some use at that point. The soldiers did have a lot of fun with a variety of things. I won't quote you the version. If you want to hear the best version of it, you need to go to the next Bobby Horton concert that's available. I highly recommend anytime you can be with Bobby to do it, and get him to do John Harrelson. He'll undoubtedly do it anyway because that's part of his Civil War routine. And John Harrelson was supposedly the person who was sending folks around to collect the contents of the night containers and bringing them back to turn into saltpeter, which of course could be used for gunpowder. So there was a whole sort of ribald kind of poem set to music that Bobby does, and it's well worth listening to and enjoying, because there's nobody does it better than he, and talks about the adventures of John Harrelson, who's going to wage war by having the ladies take the contents of their night jars and make them available for the public good, for the public service. So soldiers would use humor in a variety of ways. They would use humor when, frankly, the other focus would have been to cave into despair or despondency, to give way to negativism, and there's plenty of that. One of the things that I'm working on now is a book called, I call it Rage at the Storm, an emotional diary of the Civil War. And I'm pretty close to having that done. I'm really excited about it. It's something very unusual. It's kind of not unlike my Inglorious Passages that I did some years ago, that I think still really captures the sense that the war had terrible costs for people that weren't just killed or mortally wounded by enemy shot and shell or shrapnel. In this case, with Inglorious Passages, so many of them were victims of innocent activities like swimming, where they got cramps, or the lightning strikes, or sunstroke, or any number of things, and then foolish things like bayonet practice that they get carried away with, or again messing with these captured shells to see if they'll explode, or any number of things, and all of the ways in which the war exacted a terrible toll from people, soldiers and civilians, because of course civilians would have terrible incidents that occurred as well. Probably the most famous of those were the industrial accidents that cost so many young women and children their lives, as situations occurred, like the time in Richmond where a friction primer got caught in a board, and the idea was, well, we'll get it out of the board by slamming the board on the table, and of course the friction primer goes off, and the whole place blows up, and tremendous casualties among the workers, and most of them are horribly burned or affected by the explosion itself. Some of them will continue to linger, and then they'll pass away, or some of them will be fortunate to survive, but with gruesome injuries. And that was, par for the course. The North had its share of industrial situations that went awry as well. Steamboat accidents, train wrecks, and train boiler explosions. If you can think of it, I tried to put an example or multiple examples in that book, Inglorious Passages. And this is kind of similar in some ways, because, of course, some of these incidences are involved in this volume as well, where, again, someone seems to be healthy and hale and hearty, and next thing you know, they're struck down by disease, which, as we know, killed far more people than enemy bullets did. Soldiers who not only were the early war victims of disease, but disease that continued to afflict even the veterans, and accidents that continued to affect even the veterans. I think one of the saddest tales that I write about is the story of a young Virginia cavalryman who's going to come home because he's relatively close to the home place, and he decides to ride his horse home, and then he comes to the river that he's probably crossed hundreds of times as he grew up, and this time it happened to be swollen with heavy rain. And he put the horse into the water, I'm sure not unlike he had done as a young man before, and here he is swept away by the current, he and the horse both disappearing, and his desire to see the good old home folks had backfired and cost him his life. So we've got a lot of examples of humanity and human circumstances. And of course, humor is one of the more unique things that mankind can experience to try to deal with situations that we see high and low, again from Abraham Lincoln all the way down to the private and then to the civilian at home. So I hope you've enjoyed this few moments of kind of looking back at the war. Again, I want to thank one of my favorite people. We miss him, Bud Robertson, for the work he's done through all these years of highlighting the lives of A.P. Hill and Stonewall Jackson, and then, of course, the common soldier and civilians as well. He's got a wonderful diary that he did a lot of annotation for John Beauchamp Jones, the clerk of the war clerk who wrote an extensive diary in the Civil War. A woman by the name of Judith Brokenbrough McGuire that he did as well. So we thank Bud for all of the things he did, and of course, Soldiers Blue and Gray. And then Bell Wiley. I never had the opportunity to meet him or get to know him, but Bell was one of those people that really paved the way with the life of Johnny Reb and the life of Billy Yank. And we thank him for the work he did to make these stories come to light for generations of people, as those books continue to inspire and inform us. And of course, I guess one of my favorite people that loved a good story and loved a dry sense of humor was the great Ed Bars. There were so many times that he would go on a tour and love to drop that little tidbit, that little jewel, that little piece of history that also sort of sometimes had the off-color humor or had the little sly smile come across his face as he told it. So we thank those generations have gone before. I hope that those of you who are listening can pick up some of those volumes and return to just an enjoyment of living life vicariously through these men and women who experienced the American Civil War, the war between the states, or as someone once said on a movie, the late unpleasantness. And until next time, this is Brian Wills. Have a good day, and we'll talk to you again.